In this video, I'm going to show you how you can take multiple squares of weaving and attach them all together to make a bigger piece. So let's get started. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be attaching 4 squares of weaving together. Now, this is going to be a totally finished square on all sides that's not meant for a woven wall hanging, but you can do this for a woven wall hanging as well. You just want to remember that whatever is your bottom piece, you're going to want to have fringe on potentially, and whatever your top piece is, you might want to have the loops on. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this. I'm going to be doing this on a small scale, but you can do this with any size of woven piece. There are many different structures of weaving, so we're only going to be working with one today, but this is one that I think would work really, really well for making a big piece, whether that be potentially something like a blanket, maybe a scarf this could work for. However, there is going to be a decidedly front and back side. So I'm using 4/8 cotton, and I'm going to warp my loom with a single warp. That means we're only putting 1 string between each of the notches. This is a 4 ends per inch loom, and I'll be using a super bulky yarn as my weft yarn. So just keep that in mind that I'm working with that specific structure. So I've warped a total of 14 strings onto my loom. This amount doesn't really matter. I am going to be working with an even amount of strings just so that I can knot these in groups of 2 at the very end. So now I'm just going to tape down my loom so it doesn't slide around on me. I'm going to weave a piece of cardstock into the bottom of this. This one is about 2 3/4 inches. Very random number, not sure why it ended up that way, but you're going to want enough that you can easily do your overhand knots at the bottom and at the top. So I'm just going to weave this in using plain weave. So that's over 1 string, under 1 string. And then we can grab our yarn. So I'm using a super bulky yarn. I will link what I'm using for tools and materials in the description box below. And I'm going to grab about 3 arms lengths. I'm not sure I'm going to even need that much, but we can figure that out later. So I'm not going to start this piece with a twining stitch at all. So I'm just going to go straight into my plain weave. So that's over 1, under 1, all the way across. And this entire little square is going to be plain weave. Now I'm going to keep in mind that for mine, I want to do knots at the top and bottom. So I need to leave about this much at the top as well. So my squares aren't going to be very big. But again, if you were making a woven wall hanging and this was your top piece, for instance, you would want to leave enough that you can get that around a dowel. One thing to keep in mind if you really want your pieces, especially when stacking from the top and bottom, to look seamless once they're attached, is you're going to want the top of the next piece to be woven the opposite of the bottom of the first. I hope that that makes sense. So where this weft is going over, under, over, under, over, you would want the one that you're stacking it on top of to be the opposite. So the one below it would be under, over, under, over, and that's really going to give you that seamless look. And I thought that that was an odd amount of weft strings woven in, but it's actually an even amount. So you can see that on this first row, I was going over, under, and on this last row, I have under, over. So just keep that in mind. I am going to weave each of these squares exactly the same, even down to how I wove this cardstock in, so that these will all line up. So I started with my cardstock going under, over, and my first row over, under. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to stop weaving here, and I'm going to flip this over so that we can tuck in the ends. I will save this tape for the next one. So I'm just going to grab a plastic yarn needle, and I'm going to just weave this back in. So I'm going to go through this channel, and someone made a really good recommendation if you're a little bit worried about these ends coming out. So you can weave them up through a channel, and then you can actually go back down through another one. And this will just add a little bit more security, especially if you were making something like a blanket or a scarf that is going to get handled quite a bit. You can still see that it's fairly invisible. You can't really see that from the front, so it still looks good. And then we can just cut off the excess. Some people even recommend, if you are making something that is going to be washed ever, that you actually just don't cut off the ends until you've washed the piece, because there will be some shrinkage, and then you can trim off all those ends afterward. So for this one, you see how this string if I go like this, we're kind of missing this. I'm gonna just take this under this string like so that that edge is finished off a little bit nicer. And just like the other one, I'll go through 3 loops in one direction, and then I will do 3 loops in the opposite direction. All right, so I'm gonna pull out my cardstock now, and I'm gonna start on this end, and I'm gonna pull off 1 loop at a time, and I'm gonna do an overhand knot, and I'm gonna butt that knot right up to the edge of my weaving. And I wanna pay really close attention to get this as straight as possible as I'm knotting these. It doesn't have to be completely perfect, but you just wanna try to get it the same so that that top and bottom are straight. Now I'm gonna flip this over, and I'm just gonna take this piece off the loom. And on this one, I'm gonna have to cut open these loops because we have sort of this single one and then that was a loop. So I'm gonna cut open all the loops. And then before I start knotting this, I'm actually gonna just grab a book, just something you can weigh down the piece with to make this a little bit easier. You can see that this is wanting to come apart. So we're gonna have to like push that back into place as we knot. So I'm gonna push this up a little bit and then push that overhand knot right up against this. So I have all my knots tied. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna go and sew all of those ends in. Now this is the front of my little woven piece. We're gonna flip it over to the back. Again, you can utilize something like a book to make this easier. I'm gonna trim off this knot, and I'll also trim off this knot. And then I have another little yarn needle, and you can use this for tucking in the ends as well. You don't need both the plastic and the metal, but the metal one is better for this part. So I'm gonna thread my metal needle, and then I'm just gonna take these ends up 3 or 4 loops. If you're feeling a little bit paranoid, you can do the extra loop there. And if your ends are a little bit too short, you can actually sew your needle in first. So grabbing just these loops on the back and then thread your needle and pull it through. We're not gonna cut off these ends just yet, so just leave those for now. And then I'm gonna flip this over and do the same on the other side. All right, so this little piece is all prepped for attaching to the next one, but I'm gonna weave 3 more of these exactly the same as this one. All my squares are woven, and now we're ready to start attaching them together. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna attach end to end. So these are the actual warp string ends. So I'm gonna flip these over like this, and you can see I'm gonna do just sort of a checker pattern for this example. You're gonna wanna grab a little yarn needle again. I'm gonna take a piece of my warp string to do this. Now, I don't exactly know how much I'm gonna need, but I'm gonna say just like a half arm's length. I know that's just one single arm, but it's kind of not a big deal. This is way more than I need, but because I'm doing multiple things, I figure might as well grab a little extra. So you'll notice that we're working from the back, and we have these sections where we have the knots, and then we have these little loops between each of those notches. Now, what I wanna do is I wanna first feed my needle between the 2 warp strings that makes up this knot. So you can see how there's a warp string here and a warp string here, and then there's our knot. So I'm gonna try to grab just inside the knot, and you can kind of see this a little bit more from this angle. So I've grabbed just that knot, and I'm gonna do the same thing on this side, just like so. Pull this through, and we're gonna leave a nice long tail and tie a knot. So I have a few inches. This is probably about 3 inches here, and I'm gonna tie this in a knot. And we want that to be quite tight because we want these pieces to butt right up against each other. So now that we have our knot in here, we can start our actual sewing stitches. So I'm gonna grab this yarn loop, but I don't wanna go all the way through to the front. So what I'm gonna try to do is only kind of partially grab it, and I'll grab the loop on the other side, and I'll just flip this over so you can see that you're not actually seeing that in the front of the piece. I'm gonna start pulling this through, but don't pull it all the way through. You're gonna use this loop here that was just created and put your needle back through it, and then we can pull that tight. So now you can look from the other side again, just to make sure that you can't see anything. So next we're gonna move to the knots again. So I'm grabbing between those two warp strings on this knot, and then between the two warp strings on this knot, pull that through, maintain this loop, feed your needle back through the loop, and then tighten everything up. So next we're on the yarn loops again. I'm just kind of grabbing partially into the yarn so that it won't show from the front, and we can once again flip it just to make sure that we're not gonna see that stitch, and flip it back over, pull this through, and feed it back through the loop. So now we're on to the next knotted loop. So through this knot and then through this one. And by through, I just mean sort of between the warp strings. I'm not actually going into the middle of the knot. And then next we're on the yarn loops again. So back to the knots. See how I'm between those two warp strings that our knot is created out of? And then I'll grab this one. So we have a warp string here and a warp string here. And then we're just gonna keep doing that till we get to the very end. All right, so I'm at the very end of this. I have kept this nice and tight. And if you flip it over, you can see that it basically disappears and it kind of just looks like the weaving continues. So this is where having these rows opposite of each other comes into play, because it literally looks like we just wove this all on one warp. And then we just need to finish this off. I'm gonna do one more stitch just on these very edge weft yarns. I probably could have done that on this end too, but it's not a big deal. So yeah, that kind of connected these a little bit better. And now we just want to create a knot. So I'm going to back up to this little loop that was created as we've been stitching. And I'm going to grab this, creating just kind of an additional loop. I'm going to do that one more time. And now I'm just creating an overhand knot over top of that. Then I'm going to take this and I can just kind of fish it right through to where those other warp strings are stitched through. So just up a few loops and pull that in. And then on this end where we first started, I'm going to sew this back in as well. So we'll just come up through here. So now that everything is stitched together this way, the reason I kept these, like I didn't cut them off before stitching these together, is just so I could pull them a little bit tighter if necessary, just to make sure everything's sitting just how we want it to sit. And then I can go ahead and carefully trim off all the excess without cutting those weft yarns, which are the horizontal ones. And since I'm not going to be attaching anything on these two ends, I am going to go ahead and cut off the excess of these as well. All right, so now that these are sewn together, I'm going to do the same thing with these two, and then I'm going to show you how you can stitch them up on the sides as well. So now I have these two lengths of weaving, and now we're going to stitch them together on the vertical. So I'm going to flip these over because again, we want to work from the back, and I'm going to grab another length of my warp string. This time I'm going to grab a full arm's length just to be safe. I'm still unsure how to properly calculate for this particular thing, so I can tell you how much string I have when I'm done. And we're gonna do this very similarly to how we did this, but it's gonna be a slightly different stitch. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab one warp string above the first loop on the blue, and then I'm gonna grab one warp string above the first loop. Ah! There's a moth in here. You wouldn't think I'd be that scared of little moths, but when it comes to yarn and wool, I will go on a moth killing rampage. So we've got a warp string here and a warp string here. We're gonna pull this through just like we did on the other two, and I'm gonna tie a knot. Now this one is gonna be a little bit different. We know we have the same amount of weft strings on both of these weavings because I specifically did that to make sure that this would work out nicely. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna skip these next two weft strings, and we only wanna grab the warp strings. So I'm gonna grab the one on the right and then the one on the left. And then we can pull this all the way through. And now we're gonna do the opposite of that. So now we're skipping the next two weft yarns. We're grabbing just the warp string between the rows from left to right this time. And you can kind of tighten this as you go. We're skipping the next two weft yarns. We're grabbing the one on the right and then the one on the left. Now we're going left to right, so skipping the next two rows, the one on the left, the one on the right. And then I'm gonna flip this over so you can see what it looks like. Oh, we have a bit of a string sticking through there. Tuck that back in. So you can see this stitch here, but that's just because it's not tight right now, but you can see these ones kind of blend into each other a little bit better. So now we're gonna go up to the next two rows from right to left, skip the next two loops, grab the one on the left, and then the one on the right. So I'm just gonna continue doing this, being sure to grab just the warp strings and tightening on every stitch basically. And again, you can keep kind of flipping it over to make sure that it's looking good. And I'm gonna do the same process all the way to the other end. So now that I'm where these two connect, it's a little bit trickier to grab the warp string. So I'm kind of having to like open this up a little bit to find that warp string. So now that I have that connected in there, again, always checking the front that it looks good still. Then you can see one little stitch right here, but I think I can just kind of move the weft yarns to kind of cover it. All right, I'm gonna keep going and then we'll meet back at the other end. So I'm at the very end now, and we're gonna have to do something a little bit different here as well. So I have this end that has been tucked back into the weaving, and I'm needing to kind of work around that. So I'm gonna try to grab the warp string from sort of this angle. So I've got it there, and I wanna grab this one as well. So I'm kind of taking them from the very edge of the piece, and that should help bring this all together nicely. So now I'm needing to knot this just like the other one. So I'm gonna go back to this stitch here, and we'll just bring that back through that loop, just so we're creating a bit of a half knot situation. And then I'm gonna go through there and do that again. Then I'll do just an overhand knot. So I have this loop, and I'm bringing my needle through like this. Just tighten that right up against what we just did. And now I can go ahead and tuck this warp string that we just sewed with back into the weaving. So I'm just gonna take it through a bunch of these loops and then trim off the excess. So here it is from the front side, all finished. I think that looks pretty good, especially since we hand sewed this. We didn't use a sewing machine at all. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this and if you're gonna try this in your next piece. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one next.